Hey everyone, and welcome to the second part of my build PC video. This section will contain the disassembly and assembly of all the parts inside the computer, including motherboard, CPU, power supply, disk drives, and all that other stuff. If you want to watch what parts I'm using, go check the introductory video or go to the boot up video for how to install or resume a Windows operating system from that point on. Alright, so first of all, I have to actually open up the PC and clean out all the sections. I should also introduce the case. This is actually a Cooler Master Cosmos 2000 case. This case holds full ATX case. This holds 5 fans, 2 on the top, 1 on the back, 1 on the bottom, and 1 optional fan for the hard drive bays. This holds 6 hard drives, 5 optical drives, or a floppy card reader section, and it has a section for USB 2, microphone, stereo, FireWire, external SATA cable, power reset. And it's designed for proper ventilation because if you look in my room, there is no windows in my room. My room is in the center of the building, so I need a very cooled PC when I have to deal with editing for many, many hours on end. So basically I have to open up the front left side. This is the ventilation duct for the video card. This actually makes extra airflow going toward out. I also have to remove the top section of my case because the fans are screwed into that section. I have to remove them during disassembly. All I gotta do is remove the top. This gives me access to the inside drive bay. I also have to remove the bottom vents. They are extremely dusty. I haven't dusted them in a very long amount of time, as you can see. Alright, first things first, I need to basically unplug all the extraneous wires and stuff. Make sure whenever you disassemble a PC, you ground yourself in some fashion. Normally you're supposed to get one of those strap clips that connect to the case bay or something, but I usually don't do that because they get in the way. So I usually just touch my hand on the power supply and it automatically grounds me. Next, I got to disconnect all the fans in this case. I have 4 fans in here: rear, 2 on the top, 1 on the bottom. Now, the best way to remember which position the fans have to go when you're putting them back in the case is to always put the screws in the direction of where they go on the mount. That's the easiest way to remember which direction. Since this faces this way, put the screws on this side. Just remember the proper orientation, because if you put it the backwards way and it's supposed to go another way, it'll either be blowing air in when it's supposed to be sucking air out and causing an overheating issue. This case is very large. It's 2 feet tall and 3 feet long in order to get proper airflow going through here. Alright. Second fan. Next up is to remove all the power cables, etc., etc., in order to get to the motherboard. So first off, I'm going to unplug the power supply main connectors to the motherboard, this is the CPU power, main power connector. The main power connector is always the hardest connector in order to get disconnected from the motherboard, because it's the main one going to the motherboard and they don't want it to fall out. The problem is when they design it this tight, you end up risking breaking the motherboard pins because it's too tight. Alright, that's all the main connectors that go to the motherboard, so I can remove the motherboard itself. Remove the power supply itself directly out of the case. held on by 4 screws in the rear. Simply just unscrew them. Now it's crucial for the power supply to be oriented correctly now. As you know, that there's actually a vent underneath the power supply inside my case. And you would be inclined to put the bottom fan over here to suck in air. That's actually the incorrect way to place this kind of power supply. It's supposed to go this way while the fan is facing inside, because this fan is actually not blowing air in, it's sucking air out through the vent over here to take out the heat. If you would simply flip it to the bottom, it would be sucking heat from the bottom in to the vent and causing a buildup of heat and causing an overheating issue with the motherboard. All you gotta do now is simply pull it out. Make sure you don't have anything else connected to it, which I do actually. I do have some ports still connected, such as the power supply to the CD-ROM drive. And of course, I also forgot, I have to disconnect the power supply from the hard drives. I always forget about that because the hard drives are mounted sideways. All the power connectors for the hard drives are here. I had to disconnect them. 1, 2, and 3. Since now that I can't move the case back into the sideways position because the bay door is open, I'm going to just pull out the power supply like this. Now I'm going to have to keep it near me because it's my really main grounding point. Now some SATA cables come with locking latches so that they don't come out, so you have to push down on the metal clips to release them. If you don't, you may risk breaking the SATA connectors on your hard drive, so be careful with that. Also, for this case specifically, I have to use right-angled connectors, because if you use standard SATA connectors, you will risk breaking the pins because there's not enough clearance room for them to bend and go into the back. And that's how I broke them originally, because at that time that was the first build. This was the first build I did with a computer, and I broke the cables that way. Now that I have the SATA cables free, I can freely disconnect all of them and unplug everything from the hard drives. The red ones are simple flat ones, so they easily just pop out after enough fiddling with them. Ow. The silver ones have the locking clasp, but you have to push them down in order to release. It's fairly simple. And this one is for the front panel exterior connector. Now I can freely pull out all the SATA cables. Now that I have all the SATA cables and disconnected, now it goes to the USB headers. These are the pins that connect to the front top USB connectors up there. And over here is the power strip. This is what controls the main controls on the top: power, LED lights, reset button, hard drive indicator, main power indicator. Simply just pull out the adapter and disconnect the external speaker. This is the speaker that, you know, when you turn the computer, you hear the beep. This is what it's for. This is the beep is for code telling you if anything is wrong. Next up is to remove the video card. The reason why I have to remove the video card because it's tied into the main back, and I have to remove it in order to get to the access to the last plug. Remember, keep yourself grounded so you don't cause any shocks. Make sure your motherboard doesn't have any of those locking clasps, because you can easily break the motherboard because you'll forget to, release the lock clasp underneath and then pull it out. Since mine doesn't, I can simply just lift it up. And pull out the board, the video card. Last cable to pull out for an audio. That's it. Motherboard, almost free. I need one more IDE cable. This goes to the CD-ROM drive. Next up is the removal of the motherboard. Simply Unscrew all 9 screws, 3 on the bottom, 3 in the middle, 3 on the top. Usually none of them are covered. On certain models, some of the screws are underneath the CPU heatsink / fan. So you would have to remove the heatsink and then reapply the thermal paste and stuff on certain models. But this one, no, everything's all on in front. Double make sure you have all the plugs and screws and everything unplugged, removed from the motherboard before pulling it out. Now before you pull it out, you have to make sure you have to slide it slightly to the left, then out. Because the pins and things that are holding the back panel in place will try to hold down onto the motherboard. So grab from the side and pull and release up. Simple as that. Now remember to always put the motherboard or any other electronic either on the anti-static bag or on some other thing like foam, because you don't want it to risk any sparks or any kind of shock toward it. Remember I said in the introductory video I no longer can use the IDE hard drive, so this will be now taken out. The cool thing about the Cooler Master, you don't need any screws holding the hard drives, not the hard drives, the CD-ROM drives to the base. All you do is you push the button and it automatically releases the bay out. Alright, next up is the preliminary installation of the CPU and heatsink. You can install the memory modules if you want, but you can I usually put them in after the motherboard is already installed. Alright, first of all, get it out of the electrostatic bag. Now you gotta be careful when doing this. You do not want to damage anything. And make sure you ground yourself. I always keep the power supply next to me to keep myself grounded, either by touching it or actually holding at least one section of myself onto the thing itself. Simply slide it out of the bag. And placing it on top of the bag to be extra safe. Now, first things first, you got to make sure you have all the stuff included. For example, the BIOS configure pin and the covering for the CPU. Now, first thing obviously is for me to mount the CPU. Simplest way to mount the CPU is to simply unplug the locking latch, lift up the cover, and pull out the protective covering cover. Now when you install a CPU chip, never touch this, never touch the bottom of the chip itself. Now you can't make a mistake on installing a chip because it simply has 2 grooves that specifically make it only one way possible. And I see them here and over there. And that means this chip has to end up going this way. So grab the chip by the edges only. And place the chip straight down. And close the lid. Now, when you lock the chip in place, it's going to feel like it's going to break. It's not breaking, it's a very tight fasten in order for all the contacts to make contact. Push, 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 and lock. That way the CPU is now firmly connected into the motherboard. Now, the second thing to do is actually mount the heatsinks. And I'm using a custom heatsink. It actually requires this base bottom, and the heatsink is very large in this. That's the reason why it requires a base bottom. Simply, now this base is designed for all different types of CPU bases, so the screws have to be the pins have to be in specific alignment to do certain slots. Since mine is a 1366, it has to be at the very edge. Same goes for the universal locking latch. It has to be in a specific position, depending on your CPU. Since this is the correct position, this X form, and you simply adjust the screws. First things we'll do is install the mounting brackets. They simply fit inside the motherboard like so. Remember never to over tighten. All right, since that fiasco's out of the way, after you already got the screw springs in the correct position and mounting position for LG 1366, you have to now deal with the heatsink. The easiest way to deal with the heatsink now, of course, is to simply detach the fan from the heatsink so that you don't have to deal with any nonsense. Now, dealing with thermal compound is a little bit tricky. You always get, this is where everyone gets worried about when installing doing it themselves. That's the thing that they always get worried about. When applying the thermal paste, which is right here, there's many different ways to apply the thermal compound to a CPU. People usually do a little bead, people usually do the whole circular thing to fill up the space, or they do a line. Either all three ways are perfectly fine. I prefer doing the line. The only thing you have to know about it is that you have to know the direction of the CPU in order for to put the line. Since this is a quad core, it follows the direction going between the pin deciders, the two pins that control where you place the CPU. Since this is this way, you put it vertically across here in the center. But if it was a dual core, it would go in the opposite direction. But if you do the bead way, then there's no problem at all. Simply unscrew the cap from the top and do a sliver of thermal grease. This way, the heat from the heatsink will spread the thermal grease and fill up all the minuscule crevices from the thing. Now here comes the little bit hard part. Make sure you pull off the protective cover. Make sure you put the mounting bracket in the correct orientation, which is really only one way. Feed it through the holes. Open it up. Lay it down. Do one double check before you put it down. Then seat the heatsink. Now it's going to be a little bit wobbly and wobbly when you first do the alignments. That's all right. You're not doomed. And now you mount this CPU. Remember, gradually screw it down in all fours. For specifically doing one side, because then you'll tip it over and risk screwing up the mounting process. Now, remounting the fan is very easily. Simply slips a clip on. There's not that much of a problem here. After you fully assemble the heatsink and CPU fan, all you gotta do is connect to the CPU fan. It's marked on the motherboard so you can't like mistakenly plug it into another fan port or something else. And it only goes in one way because it has a safety lock. Simply just push it down, light up the holes, and push it down. It won't vibrate loose or nothing. Just make sure all these things are out of the way of the fan. That's it. That's it for the installing the heatsink onto the motherboard. Now, before you begin actually installing the new motherboard into the case, you have to make sure you place the new back plate in place first, because if you can't do it after it. It's a simple matter. You just simply make sure it's in the correct position, and you push in. Like so. Make sure some of these things that you have to bend out of the way, because sometimes they get caught. So these little prong thingies, try to bend them out of the way, just a little bit, because you don't want them to break off. And that's it. All you gotta do is you make sure you have all the sockets lined up. Since I already had installed the motherboard, 3 on the bottom, 3 on the top, 3 in the middle. You have to fiddle with the alignment a little bit. It's not that hard. Line up all the holes, make sure everything is flush as possible, and simply reverse the steps of disassembling. Make sure you're grounded. Try not to touch any of the prongs really as much as possible. Always make sure you're grounded. Now before I begin connecting all the power cords and everything to the motherboard, I have to connect the power switches and USB front ports to the motherboard. I also have to connect the HD audio and the FireWire cables. Now, dealing with the front panel connectors over here, it's kind of difficult because they're very tiny, and you have to make sure you connect the positives to the negatives, the positives to the positive, the negatives to the negatives. The ones that are most difficult is the actual power LED light, because it's actually split into 2 separate pins, and it makes it worse. One more final wire is the external SATA plug connector. This goes to the front panels. This just has to be simply plugged in like a normal SATA cable would. Like I said before inside the introductory video, the cool feature of the thermal tank, 850 watts, is actually lets you choose how many plugs and outlets you could go into the thing instead of having the mismatch of all the wires inside the case. This helps on airflow and clutteredness, because this is very difficult to deal with when you have like a million wires inside here. Alright, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit shorter than your average power supply, so it has to hang a little bit. Since it's laying on the side, it's going to be a little bit difficult to mount, but once I get it in, it should be fine. Alright. Now, dealing with the power supply for the motherboard, you always have to remember to connect the primary 24-pin connector, power supply, and the either 4 or 8-pin connector for the CPU power supply. If you forget to do that, you'll blow the whole system if you don't power the CPU. Depending on your setup, a standard old LG 775P CPU would require a standard 4-pin connector. But for an Intel i5, i7 core processor, it requires the 8-pin connector. Simply slide it in like so, and let the clasp lock. Find the 4 or 8-pin ATX connector for the power supply and simply plug it in. I'm probably gonna simply tie these together before I start up, so that these wires don't go near the fans and risk potential jamming. Now the other pin connectors are the 2 PCIe running for the video cards. This also comes with a future 8-pin connector for future PCI Express cards that require an 8-pin. But since mine only requires 2, it'll use the standard 2-pin connectors. Like so. You can't screw up the connections, they only go in one direction. So don't worry about screwing them up. Alright, next up is dealing with the SATA cables connecting the hard drives. Now, when you connect the primary hard drive that holds Windows, you must connect it to the different colored SATA sockets, because that's the primary SATA socket where Windows will only recognize the primary Windows installation in this socket. If you try to plug it into another socket, it will not read it and it will say boot failure during the BIOS startup. Right now, I'm not going to be worrying about hard drive number 2 because that's simply my main bulk hard drive that stores all of my files and stuff into there. Since that's not important right now, I will not be hooking it up temporarily. I will just be hooking up the solid state drive, which is at the end, in order to do the cloning process to move everything to this drive. After the hard drives and stuff are hooked up, connect your disk drive, because you'll need it during installation. In my case, all I have to do is press the Cooler Master button and it simply locks in place. Then all I have to do is connect the SATA cable to one of the ports. Now, before I'm almost done. Before I boot up, I have to connect all the power supplies cables to the power supply unit and the items that I need to power. These SATA wires will go to the hard drives in the back. Alright, this concludes the building and assembly of my PC. Click either on the left or right to go back to the introductory video, or go to the boot up and cloning section of the review.